Our first panel will discuss the issue, what are the potential developments in the strategic environment during the next 2 decades that will drive the need for a revolution in intelligence affairs? I'm honored to present the members of our first panel. Please consult your agenda for a more expansive description of their backgrounds. Zachery Tyson Brown of Conciliant Strategies, Elsa, Kania from the Center for a New American Security, William Lahneman from the Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University, and Carmen Medina from Medina Analytics. Our moderator is Anthony Vinci. He is with the Center for New American Security and recently retired from the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. Following the order of introduction for your statements, Zachery, will you lead us off?
Yeah, thanks for that, Joe. I guess having a B last name works for alphabetical order sometimes. So first, I want to thank, of course, Dan and the ODNI for sponsoring these events, and the National Academies for hosting them. They've been great over the last couple of years, especially during COVID times. And also say what a pleasure it is to be sharing a panel with such accomplished guests today. And I should also make the standard disclaimer that I speak only for myself. My views aren't those of DoD or the IC or anyone else. So, I always thought that the most insightful moments from events like this come from the questions and the discussion afterwards. So I'm going to keep my opening remarks fairly brief, I hope. But we're here to talk about the future strategic environment, as you said, and how that environment, whatever it looks like, will necessitate a revolution in intelligence affairs. And I think it's obvious from things we can see going on even right now. For me, the strategic environment is the sort of evolving structure of international competition. That's, systems, actors, how they interact with one another, how the feedback between them sometimes results in emergent phenomena that we see as wars or financial crashes or pandemics. But that environment is just the sort of sum of billions of individual choices, interactions, and it's always changing, even when it appears stable or static at a human scale. But as these choices multiply and scale across time, I think they give rise to sort of new trends that set the conditions for future tipping points to be reached. And it's those that cause the dramatic structural changes we see as they sort of reverberate through this global system that's been knitting itself together for 50 or 100 years or more. But when we focus on the more dramatic events, or even on exciting new technologies like we have recently, like artificial intelligence or synthetic biology or whatever it is, I think we can miss kind of the larger structural interplay that's going on just beneath the surface in the environment itself. So, all that is sort of preamble. I won't claim to be able to predict what the strategic environment 20 years from now looks like. I mean, as anyone who's worked in the intelligence community knows, we're lousy at predicting the future. But I do think we can see sort of the seeds of the future right here in the present if we know where to look and if we carry those trends out over the next several years. So already the world that we live in now doesn't look a lot like the one the intelligence community was created for. That was, during the Cold War, and that period was slower paced. It operated at the speed of the carbon copy, the ambassador's cable. It was a less connected world. The nations were blocked off into 2 power blocks: the Soviet Union and the United States and its allies in Europe. Power was more concentrated then in the hands of a relatively small number of elites, and those elites could be identified and easily targeted for intelligence collection. And in that world, we squared off against the Soviet Union, which was a closed, top-down society that was hidden away behind the Iron Curtain. And so we had to invest in a lot of capabilities to pierce that curtain and find out what was going on behind the veil. And then our leader's principal challenge back then, I think, was a decided lack of information about our Soviet adversary. But if you look at that today, in contrast, the speed of relevance is measured in hours, if not minutes. Instead of sovereign states with clearly defined borders, it's a lot harder now to make distinctions between what is foreign, what is domestic. The world is one of overlapping webs of influence that run over, under, through states, political parties, even individuals. And all these issues that were once separate now brush up against one another pretty regularly, and it often has unpredictable results. People everywhere are more mobile and more connected than they ever were before. And that also means that power is far more evenly distributed, even in more autocratic states like the PRC or in Putin's Russia. And instead of being confronted by a monolithic superpower as our principal adversary, today, the United States is challenged by a diverse array of greater and lesser threats. Some of these are conventional, others are quite novel. And this threat spectrum is compounded by a parallel matrix of systemic vulnerabilities. Some of those pose existential risks all by themselves. That's internal sort of vulnerabilities that we face as a nation and as a connected world. And then perhaps most salient for the IC, instead of thirsting for information, today's leaders are practically drowning in it. There's just so much information out there, so much content to consume. And the challenge is more making sense of what is already out there rather than finding that little bit of nugget of information that's going to help them to make a better choice. Another big change is the relentless growth of the global data sphere, which you could define as the total volume of data generated all over the world. That's been doubling in size about every 2 years for the last decade. And that growth seems likely to accelerate over the next decade as the Internet of Everything becomes a reality. And we have machines and devices all over the world generating more data all the time. And so that explosion in data generates two problems, I think, for the IC. One is that while the data sphere grows sort of geometrically or exponentially, the mechanisms that we use to make sense of it, the spies, the listening posts, the satellites, those can only be added arithmetically. So we can only build so many satellites at a time. We can only download so much information from passive collection at a time, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a gap between information that could be collected and information that is actually collected. And that keeps growing larger and will probably never be closed. And then as anyone who's worked in the IC knows, there's also a big gap between information that is collected and information that is actually processed and then analyzed. So I don't know how we close that gap, and I don't think the automation that we're investing in is going to be a solve-all solution for it. The other problem that the volume information presents is that as the availability of information outside grows, the relative value of secret information and secrecy itself, I think, declines. So in this era where we're inundated with useful information that's practically everywhere and characterized by rapid change, I think the frictionless and rapid communication of data is much more important than the protection of the tools from which we derive that information. And that's why I think that private intelligence firms and open source analysis services, there's dozens of them out there now, and even all manner of new journalistic outfits, they often now beat the IC at its own game, at least in terms of speed and accessibility and convenience. And while we could say their techniques aren't as sophisticated as the ICs or their judgments are not as authoritative, I think the truth is that speed and accessibility win every time with a distracted and busy consumer base of information users who want to make sense of the world. So for 3/4 of a century now, American intelligence officers have provided our nation's leaders with secret information they needed to make better decisions. And in the context of the Cold War, that useful information was scarce. And as I said, we had to build a lot of expensive collection platforms to pierce the Iron Curtain, see what was behind it, count rifle battalions and mobile missile launchers and things like that. We went to a lot of great lengths to conceal information about ourselves, to extract information about the others, and those sources and methods had to be protected from espionage and, of course, from inadvertent disclosure too. So we still sort of labor under that security architecture today, which is one of the problems of sharing information and having this frictionless flow and exchange of ideas and data that I talked about just a few minutes ago. So I've personally reached a point where I think the security architecture of the Cold War intelligence apparatus is actually doing more harm than good, because it prevents more people from accessing more information and thus prevents them from putting that good information to use. So by themselves, all that I talked about in the last couple of minutes, a messier, more integrated global space, the unmitigated growth of the data sphere and the relatively decline in the value of secrets. I think that by itself would be enough to justify a revolution in how we think about intelligence. But there's one more thing that I'll close on that I think is going to have a very profound effect on the future of intelligence, and that is the ongoing revolution in human organizational technology, one that's changing the structures of organizations and how work gets done in organizations across the planet. And it's one that I think government in general and the IC in particular have been late to recognize and are falling farther behind on. So look in the private sector. So today's most competitive organizations are adapting to the complexity that we've just talked about and uncertainty by really getting rid of a lot of what was until very recently accepted wisdom about work and management. And they're adopting new rules and new values like authenticity, individual agency, collaboration of small teams as a norm rather than reliance upon individual expertise. They're actively reinventing themselves by integrating separate functions. They're accelerating decision-making by granting more authority and more resources to those with the most information and the greatest competency, who are often at lower levels. And they're growing more human-centric, sort of transparent, inclusive organizational cultures. And they're not doing this just to suit the preferences of, the next generation, that values collaboration and transparency. They're also doing it because these values and those methods have been proven to result in better outcomes. And they've recognized that even in an era of big data, smart machines, it's an organization's people that determine whether it will succeed or fail. And people do their best work when their talents are cultivated and coordinated, not commanded and controlled. So that's the last thing I'll mention. I think these are big challenges. To me, it's quite clear it drives us towards the need for a revolution in how we conceive and how we carry out the functions of an intelligence service. There's others we could talk about, the changing ways in which people want to receive and use information, the problem of how to prioritize information for algorithmic systems that will become such a big part of warfare. And there's also the growing divide between a cloistered intel community and the public that it's ultimately meant to serve. Those are huge challenges as well. So in short, in closing, there's plenty of reasons to justify the need for revolution. I'm grateful again to both ODNI and the National Academies for holding these discussions. And I look forward to my colleagues' remarks and the questions to follow. Thanks.
Elsa, you're up.
Anthony, would you like me to go next instead?
William, if you don't mind going next, that would be great.
Yeah, not at all. Hello, everyone. I want to start by thanking you for inviting me. What I'm going to present in the next 10 minutes might appear to actually be somewhat contradictory to what to what Zachery just said, but it isn't. It's just a different twist on it, I think, maybe making a couple variables more important. And it in no way detracts from the complexity and the multi-threat nature of the emerging international system. But in terms of potential developments, what I place at the top of the list is what I consider the existence of a multipolar international system now. You can talk about how multipolar it is and whether China and Russia are near peer competitors or whether they are actually peer competitors. But I think for futurist purposes, looking ahead 20 years, let's just call them peer competitors and say we have a multipolar system. I think it would be the US, the EU, Russia, and China, and maybe some others will enter. But in any case, that means that two of the emerging actors, Russia and China, are competitors. Again, for purposes of discussion, let's say they are actually contrary to the status quo that the United States and Western Europe and so forth have worked so hard to establish and maintain since World War II. I believe that both of those countries in different ways constitute what I would call and what many call a complex hybrid threat. And that this complex hybrid threat is a new approach to international relations, and that it will require for us to thrive, a revolution in intelligence affairs. So that's kind of my bottom line. The complex hybrid threats operate across all of the threat domains or the environmental domains listed in our terms of reference: political, military, economic, and social. And so I want to get into them a little bit and discuss why this poses such challenges to the IC. And then I do want to end with emphasizing the social dimension, and in particular, just discussing very quickly the idea of foreign policy role, or what the more business community oriented folks might call national branding, with all the importance that that term implies. So in terms of analysis, I believe, and I have used in my previous publications, Thomas Kuhn's paradigm concept, from the structure of scientific revolutions. And that approach would lead you to conclude that an IRA is needed whenever the intelligence community, in this case, right, in intelligence, although it works in other fields, but whenever the intelligence community existing processes, existing structures, existing skill sets just cannot answer the pressing questions of the day. So my pressing question of the day is this complex hybrid threat. In terms of answering these questions, in terms of the paradigm, I think, and again, I don't think it's that controversial, but you can look at the IC and look at its structures, look at its processes, and look at its skill sets. And in a way, the sum total of all that determines the paradigm. So is that paradigm up to dealing with the complex threats? So I think, unlike maybe a point of departure from Zachery, I believe there has been an RIA since the 9/11 attacks. If you look at connecting the dots, there's been a lot of emphasis on connecting various parts of the IC and the wider intelligence enterprise, that we need to confront transnational terrorism as opposed to state actors. And I would also argue that part of this RIA has been the dots. Sure, you needed to connect the dots, but you also needed to have more dots, more and different dots. And so you've had a lot of, at the time, innovative partnerships made with government, non-governmental, international actors to bring about a much expanded intelligence community, to where many people distinguish between the intelligence community, the US government, organizations, and the intelligence enterprise, which wasn't the case before. So I think there's just two main takeaways from me raising this point, and that is that the old paradigm, the Cold War paradigm, was preserved. It was retained because there's always a threat from state actors, always a threat. And now there is an emerging, increasing threat. So thank goodness we retained it. But sometimes that takes people aback because they go, well, I thought it was a revolution. I thought we were supposed to have a whole different, palette of intelligence processes and structures and so forth. No, I think it's reasonable to preserve what works. And the entire Cold War intelligence enterprise worked and continues to work, and I hope it's still working very well. But the second point I wanted to make from this revolution in intelligence affairs is that it didn't have to be integrated. Group A, so to speak, was looking for terrorists. Group B was worrying about state actors and military and economic developments as before. So complex hybrid threat. I believe a complex hybrid threat to be a state actor that acts in a coordinated fashion across all security domains. So, coordinated fashion across all security domains to achieve its national interests. Why? Because they can, because of the advances that have been mentioned in many other parts of these colloquia. So take like the new Russia, as opposed to the old Russia. Sure, they're still political and military and economic, but it seems to me that they are heavily integrated into the social domain. And I'm talking about cyber crime, cyber espionage, cyber warfare, influencing operations, interfering operations, radicalization of population, segments, gridlocking legislatures, election tampering, various other forms of social engineering, funding separatist organizations, and other things, as well as modernizing their military, having expeditionary forces here and there, aggressive actions towards their near abroad, and so forth. In a coordinated fashion. That's the important point I want to make. Now, I can't see behind the curtain anymore, so I don't know if what I just said has any merit. Maybe the intelligence community is ahead of me. Maybe they know this isn't the case. Russia's just muddling through. I don't know. But it seems reasonable for purposes of this discussion to figure that somebody's sort of watching the shop and that it's in charge and it's coordinated. If so, is the intelligence community as currently configured able to deal with that level of complexity from a single actor? And my belief is that China is different in certain ways as a complex threat than Russia. And to the degree that that the IC is not able to do that, then the revolution in intelligence affairs is required. Now, there's many ways I could go with this, and other speakers have already talked, about AI and the need for integration of various technologies and so forth. But what I would just argue is it might be very useful to have a look at enterprise architecture of the IC, because I believe that achieving the level of intelligence fusion, intelligence integration, whatever term you want to use, to actually know what's going on with these complex hybrid threats is revolutionary and probably is not occurring quite yet. And so while I hate to recommend another layer or another office or something like that, to an organization like the IC that has already criticized why is it so complex and all that. No, I think it would be necessary and very, very important, because it's not at all clear that we're on a par with these peer competitors in our manipulation of the social space. And so to conclude, I believe, are we equipped to wage what I'll call social warfare? And that would be both defensive and offensive. What are these adversaries doing and why? What is their end game of the entire effort across all threat domains? And then what should we do, both in response to their actions, but also just as a general improving the US strategic stance in the world? And I think here's where the idea of foreign policy role comes in. Research I did some time ago indicated at the time that countries are perceived in a coherent fashion by other countries, and that it's not a trivial matter. It's fairly important. So are we kind of working to improve our foreign policy role or our national branding? And if not, it's very important to ask why not, And then if so, what do we have to do there? And I believe lots of revolutionary changes are needed in the IC, both technologically based, organizationally based, process-based, and skill sets. And that is about my 10 minutes, so I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Carmen, would you mind going next?
Not at all. Thank you. And as the other speakers, I very much appreciate the chance to offer my comments on an issue that I've considered to be very important pretty much my entire career. So you could say I've always thought that we needed a revolution in intelligence affairs, and therefore I'll never be satisfied. So I want to, I think, speak a little differently than the other two speakers. And I'll start by saying that I have always been dissatisfied with work on the future. So I believe in this panel attempting to describe how the strategic environment might change or what it would look like 20 years from now. And I find that most of the time, all of us, and I include myself in this, although I'm going to try not to do that in my remarks, but all of us, when we think about the future, tend to take whatever we're concerned about today and project it 20 years forward. It is, I think, almost impossible for us to jump those 20 years, think about what could have happened during those 20 years, and then really ponder what the differences would be in the world 20 years from now. 20 years is a long time. I mean, I was a senior leader at the CIA 20 years ago. And I remember some of the things that we talked about then. We talked about China's rise. We were actually just beginning to become aware of China's rise, although we did not fully appreciate what it was going to become. We were worried about nuclear proliferation, North Korea, Iran. We were really worried about US economic competitiveness vis-a-vis the rest of the world. And of course, uppermost at that time was terrorism. So what were some of the things that we didn't think a lot about, as I remember 20 years ago? Cyber. I mean, we were just beginning to enter into the technology age, but we really, I don't think, had any appreciation of what cyber warfare was going to be like. We didn't really think about the return of nationalism as an incredibly important element in national and international politics. We didn't think a lot at the time about the US as a problem in international affairs. I mean, we always, from the US perspective, took sort of US stability and competence as a given. And we have become aware that the US can be a problematic actor in international affairs. I don't think 20 years ago, we really appreciated the possibility of the Chinese governing model emerging, well, the Chinese government system emerging as a model for the rest of the world, or a potential model for the rest of the world, and what that could mean. We weren't thinking a lot about climate change. We're thinking a little bit about climate change. I think it was mostly discussed in terms of the environment. And to return to that cyber point, and I think this is huge, we didn't really appreciate at all the potential for disinformation and the decline of truth in modern societies. And I think that's huge, that 20 years ago, I don't remember any of us ever talking about that. I do recall some analysts coming to me and saying, like in 2004, 2005, you don't realize what's coming next. It's going to be social networks, and it's going to change everything. I heard them, I obviously remember them saying that to me, but it went right over my head. I wasn't in any way understanding of what that could mean. So what can I imagine happening between now and 2040, that when you think about the intelligence community in 2040, you need to think about, okay, it's going to be post this. So I would bet that it's going to be post a moment or a clash between US and China of some kind. Not sure what it could be. Hopefully it will not be catastrophic, because then we're talking about something completely different. I know Admiral Stavridis has said that when his colleagues talked to him about his book 2034, which imagines a US-China war, the number one comment from his colleagues is, that's too late. It's going to happen before then. So imagine a world where there's some kind of US-China clash has already occurred. Perhaps it's inconclusive. If it's inconclusive, it means that wasn't good for the US. I imagine between now and 2040, a decline in US technology dominance. I think that, China and many other countries are involved in advancing on a whole broad range of technology issues. And we can imagine that the US superiority in technology will be eroded by 2040. I can imagine across the world greater emphasis on internal instability and domestic intelligence for a variety of issues. And I also believe by 2040, or in the intervening years, we will grow increasingly nervous about what I think will be the issue that will dominate the second half of this century, which is population decline. If you look at population estimates, and that's one of the few trends that is hardwired and really matters in terms of thinking about the future, 55 countries, including China, will have a declining population by 2050. And I think that that is just going to be such a wake-up call for elites, political scientists, theorists of every kind. And I don't think we or the intelligence community are ready from it. So just a few comments about that and a couple of other things that I think will characterize the strategic environment in 2040. Declining world population. Population growth is an assumption about everything we do in human society. It's an assumption in our politics. It's an assumption in our economies. It's an assumption in our retirement savings. It's an assumption in our military strategies. So how we think about the world has to, I think, in that context, be completely recalibrated. And the intelligence community, like everyone else, sort of has all these assumptions baked into how it thinks about things like social stability. For example, I'll give you somewhat, I think it's comical example. Historically, we've worried about the youth bulge. You know, tracking the parts of the world that have the youth bulge is an important thing to do if you want to get a sense of where there might be more instability, more sort of crisis of expectations in parts of the world. Well, very few countries are going to have a youth bulge in 2040, and most of them are going to be in sub-Saharan Africa. And instead, what you're going to have is a cranky middle-aged people bulge all around the world as people are dealing with a working age. I have to pay more taxes because I have to support all the seniors up above me, and there's not enough young below me to support me. I'm going to be very cranky. And I think that could be a significant issue. There has long been a correlation, as I mentioned earlier, between the percentage of a population that is young, male, because that's how it correlates, often unemployed and unmarried, and political instability. Well, as I said earlier, about the only place that is likely to occur, although it will also occur in China, interestingly enough, because of the distorted male-female ratios there, will be in sub-Saharan Africa. So as I was thinking about really outlandish things to say at this panel, but outlandish in a way that I think are nevertheless possible, race-based terrorism in the world. Is that a possibility where you have the global South, where you're going to have the youth bulge that exists will be there? Is there a possibility that they may embrace concerns of people of color in the West and the United States? And could something like that happen? I don't know. I mean, it probably all depends upon the emergence of some charismatic leader who gets obsessed with this issue, as is often the case when you think about using violence that way. A third one, a thing I think is completely possible in the environment of 2040, is some type of more controlled technology environment. I'm not a technologist, so I'm not that good at thinking about it. But for example, China now has an internet silo. Russia is trying to develop one. Are we going to have more internet silos, and how will that affect the work of the intelligence community? I can imagine an international convention on the use of artificial intelligence. How might that affect the intelligence community's plans to embark on these? And I also constantly worry about whether or not in all of these hacking episodes that are occurring around the world, whether someone hasn't implanted a zero-day bug or bomb that will take down important Western technological platforms when we most need them. So I think that's an issue of concern. And then the fourth and last thing I'll mention, I think, the declining population and the issue of young, unmarried men, unhappy men, is going to affect one country particularly hard, and that's going to be China. And so I wonder whether or not in the intervening years, by 2040, the intelligence community might be dealing with a somehow crippled China that is creating all sorts of other problems in Asia. And one last point, the country that will have the greatest population by 2040 is India, often overlooked in these discussions. In fact, I've overlooked it as well. But think about India and and understanding India as a tremendous challenge for the intelligence community in 2040. And I'm done.
Thank you. Elsa?
Good morning, everyone. And first, thank you so much to the organizers for the flexibility about my having attempted to exist in a state of superposition. A metaphor often used as an aficionado of quantum technology, living life across several places or spheres at once. And I would actually think that my remarks will hopefully build upon and hopefully expand upon the great insights of my fellow panelists. So I will start, I guess, with the typical caveat that I am speaking, as always, only from a personal perspective and representing my own viewpoints and experiences. And I come to these issues as an analyst who has worked in the open source, focused on the question of China and concerned equally, as we've just heard, with the prospects of its rise and the underlying insecurity and instability that accompanies that. I have also, as in an academic capacity, in the course of working on research, sort of grappled with some of the urgent questions that I think are facing all of us in the space around even academic freedom and exchange at a moment when U.S.-China relations are more fraught. Yes, finally, as I'll also speak, I think, on a theme of current personal relevance as a volunteer who has been engaged in initiatives facilitating informal evacuation from Afghanistan, because I believe that's a compelling example in a number of respects of some of the trends that we've discussed, often in the abstract, about the power of networks and the challenges of operating in conditions of uncertainty, such as this present moment. And I think there are some themes and concerns that do tend to cut across these different contexts and challenges today. This first, I'd say, certainly China is at the forefront of all of our minds today as a strategic competitor and a challenge, and I am concerned that we are not prepared, that we are only just starting to really grapple with what the full strategic impact would be if the US were to lose the leadership and superiority that we have taken for granted in recent history. We are only just beginning to really try to position ourselves against the intellectual challenges of great power competition, let alone come up with a coherent understanding of what GPC is in practice beyond a phrase that has become ever more popular in the discourse, certainly a characterization of our environment that does not necessarily give us prescriptions as to how to adapt to it. And I think I'm also concerned about how we reckon with China, given that the fraught moment we're in has cut off many of the prior channels of insight and engagement that I think were critical to avoiding what I worry we are heading towards, which I would characterize as mutually assured misperception. That I think there is a great risk of misunderstanding between the US and China, both because of how different our two countries and societies are, but also because of some of the parallels or similarities that occur in tandem. And I think whether it is the availability of sort of enough talent with Chinese language proficiency or having natural language processing, for instance, within the intelligence community, positioned to process the amount of information that is available in the open source at scale. I think there are some very fundamental considerations that have yet to be sort of fully grappled with when it comes to thinking about having the capacity to really turn our attention in earnest to the different dimensions of China's rise. And then certainly as someone who, as an analyst and academic, works a lot with the open source, I tend to believe that we are, on one hand, undervaluing, and on the other hand, taking for granted the resources that exist in that domain, because sort of the capacity to integrate across ints and to bring that data into conversation with other resources, I think, has been lacking by many accounts. And I think there is a certain urgency as well when it comes to trying to build up that capacity, given a trend that I think many of us who work in China have seen, that although China is less mysterious and information can be far more available than many would appreciate at present, there is starting to be, I think, a closing and improved operational security such that information that was more accessible weeks ago, months ago, years ago is now becoming less so. So I think trying to figure out how to get the use of open source right and think about the fragility of that as well, and the fact that each discovery and leveraging of that information may provide instruction to the PRC as to how to limit access against the backdrop of intense censorship and controls of information across the board. I think those will be considerations as well going forward. So I think we have to sort of recognize that sort of the open source as a resource, as a domain, as a concern is critical, but it is constantly evolving in terms of what is possible and what is acceptable. And I think along those lines, I'd also point to, I think, the fact that some of the research happening in that space illustrates the flexibility and unconventional contributors that are really taking the lead at times in these efforts. The fact, for instance, that a lot of the reporting on discoveries about China's nuclear posture that have driven the debate were made by interns or students who were doing this resource based on the capabilities of commercial companies. And I think that really speaks to the fact that the barriers to entry are lower in a world where information is so much more accessible. And I think that highlights the importance of sort of thinking beyond traditional outlooks on sort of hierarchy and experience and drawing upon the talent and contribution of those who are eager to help and eager to get involved, and sort of thinking what types of expertise or proficiency are most relevant to bring into the conversation with the more established stakeholders within the intelligence community in some capacity, or how to have improved exchanges across these worlds, across these disciplines, and across some of the barriers that often make those engagements challenging at best. And I guess I'd say also in China, whether we're talking about analysis, academic research, or diplomatic engagement, whether it's the impact of the pandemic or this difficult moment in US-China relations, I think the avenues or the conversations that are happening are more and more constrained. So although I think the Cold War is an imperfect metaphor at best and can be misleading in describing where US-China relations may be heading, I think we do have to sort of look back at techniques that have fallen out of practice and think about how do we study and how do we understand a country that does not want to be studied or understood, and where even for academics who have no connection to national security, there are more and more risks and security concerns associated with travel to China, with the sorts of dialogues or field work that used to be much more mainstream and now are becoming perilous for all involved, whether that is in political science or the sciences or otherwise. I think a lot of the sort of background and contextual understanding that has been really critical is going to be limited and difficult at best going forward. So yeah, I think there's definitely going to be challenges in terms of how we reckon with China as a pure competitor, while also dealing with the sort of the realities of the complexity and tragedy that is in the world that goes beyond the rubric of great power competition, so to speak, but has, I think, immense implications as well for US trust, credibility, and confidence, and certainly some of the systemic problems and incidents where Beijing is prepared to leverage these cases to advance their narrative and their interests in ways that we, I think, may be just starting to reckon with the impacts of. And by that, I mean the current situation in Afghanistan, which I would say first and foremost is a tragedy, and one that is too soon perhaps to be drawing any lessons learned as to warning, as to the difficulties of maintaining situational awareness in that kind of environment. And I'd say I'd point first and foremost to the urgency and to the humanitarian challenges, but I'd also say that I think what we are seeing playing out in real time really illustrates, I think, the sort of revolution that is occurring, and perhaps not so much in intelligence or rumant, arguably, is some of what is driving the efforts on the ground, but the capacity of networks, individuals and those seeking to volunteer and contribute to have great impact in real time and responding with flexibility and trying to break through barriers, organize on social media, on different apps and channels, using tools that are commercially available and in ways that can really, I think, demonstrate the importance of these types of informal initiatives and how those, and raise questions about how those can best be coordinated with or interacting with more formal channels and procedures, especially in a moment where the situation is so dynamic and where we're seeing sort of threats and challenges evolving in real time. And I think the sort of overarching concerns as well about how to react when tools and techniques that were once the purview of the US government, such as the biometric systems and capabilities, are readily exploited and turned against those who are most vulnerable. So I think I guess in closing, I would say, I think this is a moment where we are seeing very different but interrelated challenges playing out in parallel and in ways that will have a lot of impact for US standing, for our capacity to understand and be engaging with the world. And I think the Chinese Communist Party often describes this as a time of profound changes unseen in a century, whether that is geopolitics, technology, multipolarity, or in the CCP's view, the decline of the US and a shift to a more chaotic world. And I think the question is, are our systems and institutions, and are we as individuals prepared to adapt and respond with the urgency that is required to be commensurate with the tragedies and the challenges and the complications inherent in navigating this world? So I will pause there for now and very much look forward to continuing the conversation today and going forward.
Thanks so much to all of you. That really fascinating comments. So much to cover. Luckily, we're running a few minutes early, so I think we get a little extra time to tackle some of these. And there's a lot of really good questions coming in. So many, in fact, that I'm going to try to combine several of the questions in whatever way I can so that we can kind of get through as many as possible. So where to start? The 20-year question is really interesting to consider. And it is a long time. To Carmen's point earlier, it's really hard to think 5 years into the future, let alone 20 years. And if anyone could do that, they'd be an instant billionaire, amongst other things. But nonetheless, whether the IC wants it to be the case or not, I think there is some pressure from its consumers to think into the future, and poor people like Dan Flynn actually get paid to try to think that far into the future, and it's a very challenging thing. So let's kind of start. Let's start there. And there's a couple of questions that address that. One from Francis Tammer saying, what was the intelligence community saying 2 decades ago about the current environment? What can we learn from this and provide signposts that might be changing? And then, which is something that Carmen was talking about earlier, and I think is implicit in many of the other comments. And then Lewis Shepard also brought up a more pointed question for Carmen, actually, about, said, I was puzzled by Carmen Medina's excellent observations that 20 years ago, we didn't ever envision the emergence of China governing model for the rest of the world. The Chinese model has in fact been well observed and described since the early 60s, both in its Maoist centralized authoritarian strand and its Deng era emerging markets economic attractiveness, both of which are now combined in Xi's strategy. We were aware of all this 20 years ago now. Carmen, can I ask the question like this and challenge you a little bit? 20 years ago, I agree with you, probably the specifics were unpredictable of where we would be. But But in more general terms, could we have made, and how should we think about making organizational changes to react to the nature of the environment changing as a whole? I think, for example, 20 years ago, we were clearly past the bipolar Cold War stage. We were into a proliferation of threats, not non-state actors being much more prominent. We might not have known on August 25th, 2001, that terrorism by a couple of Middle Eastern-based groups would, dominate American foreign policy for the next 20 years. But I think many people in the business, as it were, back then did know that non-state actors were proliferating. From that kind of higher level perspective of the shape of the international system, and William, I'm going to come back to you about this as well, because you were bringing up the multipolar environment. How would you think about organizational changes in the IC to react to the structural changes occurring in the international environment, such as a multipolar world, such as potentially a peer competitor, such as Elsa was bringing up implicitly and explicitly, the sort of increasing complexity and chaos, in a sense, in this environment? How organizationally would you think about that in terms of how the IC agencies are organized, either within the agencies or the relationships to other agencies? What changes would you make or recommend, or how would you process that?
Thanks. I would say that historically, my observation was that intelligence failures tended to occur most often in the gaps between accounts. So we create accounts, so we categorize the world, and I actually think that the first and often overlooked step in intelligence analysis is categorization. And we rarely go back and look at our categorization schemes. And let me give you an example. I think this is a really important point. I once asked my analysts how often they went back and examined the read profiles that determined what information the computer presented to them. And they said, oh, I don't know. I inherited that from Joe, who was on the account 5 years ago. I determined by talking to our analysts that was not something that they did. They didn't routinely look at that logic statement that determined what they read. And so it just ran on automatic forever and ever. So I think that we have to be much less enamored of this account structure and view it as more fluid and frankly, less structured, and actually, which we've tried various times and frankly done poorly on it, I admit, have capabilities that are constantly trying to spot new and emerging issues. And I think as long as that capability sits within the structure of the intelligence community, it's not going to be very good. I think the only way that you can do that is have a purposeful partnership, teaming strategy with organizations that are not encumbered by the worldview of the US policymaker, and therefore do a much better job of scanning issues like that. But I do think that everything about how we organize the work of the intelligence community tends to put our thinking into concrete. And here, this is where paying attention to the details really matters. Something as simple as what you're reading, what logic statement determines your reading profile needs to change. And this is hard because strict organizational boundaries and account structures are very important bureaucratically. You never want your account to shrink. You always want it to grow, and you'll do whatever you can to make it grow. But I would offer that, and I'll stop here.
Yeah, I like that diagnosis. The gaps between accounts is where intelligence failures occur. I think that's very insightful, and it actually. I want to then turn it to Zachery. There's kind of a related question, and I want to bring up one of the. Along with that question, one of the comments you made, Zachery. So there's a question about how you mentioned that the intelligence community is poor at predicting the future. It's not the role of the intelligence community to predict the future. Can only provide a range of scenarios underpinned by a degree of probability. This best assists decision-making and planning. It's very important to educate to these policymakers accordingly. And the person asking the question said, whilst I agree with the RIA and the profusion of information, with borders less important, there will always be a role for good old-fashioned diplomacy, with the very recent manifestation of the head of the CIA being dispatched to meet the Taliban founder. And I think the questioner was looking for your thoughts on their view. I would ask the question like this, and building on what Carmen brought up about gaps between the accounts, where do you see the IC going in terms of those gaps, not as it relates to the specific accounts like terrorism, counterterrorism versus, say, counter narcotics or something like that, but in terms of its roles, to this questioner's points, in terms of its role as organization that should be predicting the future versus not, or as its role as intelligence gathering versus de facto diplomacy, which is what the director was just involved in essence. How does that evolve over time in your view? And the other area I would bring up, as you mentioned, is the role of open source and commercial intelligence. And so how does that evolve? So how do you see the intelligence community evolve as the roles change, not just the singular accounts?
Wow, well, that's a
just
lot.
Thought I'd give you an easy one. Yeah.
Let me try to remember everything you asked. So first of all, I would say, diplomacy is not only the role of the State Department. There's, military diplomacy. There's numerous contacts between agencies within the intelligence community and their sister agencies in partner nations and allied nations. So that goes on all the time. And honestly, I think increasingly diplomacy is going to be more of a salient role for everyone across the executive branch and in the military services, because everyone is a representative of this country. And there's so many interactions between U.S. Officials, and not only in government, but also private sector, CEOs, heads of accounts for developing technologies. They all work with foreign audiences on a daily basis. Many of our multinational corporations that are headquartered here in the States have employees from all across the world, and they're working with them every single day, either in a distributed fashion via Zoom or whatever. And we've seen a lot of that also over the last year. So that speaks to a sort of disaggregation of all these points of contact. So there's got to be some kind of sum total of all those interactions that equates to what the strategic environment is. So it's going to be important for everyone to recognize their role in either adding to or detracting from American influence going forward. The other thing I think is, you mentioned in terms of roles, I think that we have to get away from this idea that the intelligence community's role is to predict the future. I think we need to shift, and that's one function of what I think a revolution in intelligence should be. We need to shift the value proposition of the intelligence community to helping decision makers make better decisions as events come and go, because we're in this more sort of fluid environment, as Carmen mentioned. We're horrible at predicting things in any case. We're not going to be able to say what the next big thing is going to be, most likely. We're very bad at predicting what the next war is going to look like. It's always wrong. So instead of picking a most likely course of action, as we would say in the military intelligence world. We need to envision a range of possible futures that are within, bounded perhaps by certain limits, what's within the realm of imagination, and then to help policymakers come up with adaptive policies that can shift right or left as events sort of carry them forward, and to be more flexible instead of planning for a program that's going to take 4 or 5 years to carry out, and something comes up and it invalidates that program. And just to kind of tie that onto the recent example of, we don't know what happened with Afghanistan planning, withdrawal and evacuation of SIVs and everything, but if we had perhaps been more flexible in our planning on this eventuality, we could have more rapidly shifted to adapt to the very rapid collapse of the Afghan government and the Afghan National Security Forces, that it doesn't look like anyone said it was going to happen as fast as it did. So that's just an example of events sort of taking over our planning processes and our intelligence forecasting processes. And we need to be more flexible in general on that. And the last thing I think you said was something about the role of open source. And I would just say on that note, I think open source is such an important capability because it is outside that realm of those sort of those bins that Carmen was talking about. We put boundaries between the things. So if we have 1 million sources out there in the world that are gathering useful information, and if we're monitoring that, that is not prone to your subjective listing of priorities and topics and regions and functions. You're going to see what may bubble up sort of organically from out there in the world from these open sources that wasn't on your priority list of things. One of the things that I often say is, when you make a list of what you're going to collect for, you're already subjectively identifying what you're looking for, and we always find what we're looking for, and we're surprised when what we're not looking for finds us first instead. So that's why I think the shift to a more open source architecture would enable us to be more fluid and agile and all those good words you hear about all the time, and get us away from these sort of reductive linear plans that we've made and that are always frustrated when the course of events sort of overtake them.
By the way, for everyone on the panel, feel free to jump in and ask each other questions or come back, and otherwise I will continue to work my way through the question list.
Can I jump in on a point?
Yep.
Zachery's posting of the Global Trends 2020 document just made me recall that when I was at the University of Maryland, we were contractors, like many others, on the 2015 and the 2020 document. And take China. We didn't do China. We did Future of the Nation State, for example. But the IC called in all kinds of experts, open source information. And we had, I assume if it was like Maryland's process, we had a number of conferences and workshops where we bandied about what's the future of China, and at the time, I remember the consensus being that the mixture of authoritarian communist government with free market democracy was incompatible. And since this was the era of the Washington Consensus, democracy would triumph. I mean, this was a very positive kind of peace dividend era. And so the IC had a couple of choices. They could go with the Delphi technique of all these experts kind of giving a coherent picture that China would essentially collapse of its own internal inconsistencies, or they could go off and generate some contrarian view. And so I bring it up just because I do happen to know some of the details of that, and I don't know how you can necessarily fault the IC. It's just happened to not be true. And that plays, it plays to what Zachery was saying about things happen. It's complex. There's a lot going on. But, methodologically, I think the IC did what any competent group would do to try to tease out information on something that is essentially unknowable.
I'm going to go. This is a question for Elsa, and someone just sent in from a graduate student, and they're asking, do you think that our higher education system should start to focus more on China and Chinese studies and languages that help the future of our relationships. What would that effort on our part make China more at ease or trusting in regards to how open they are to communicating with us? And this really gets towards, I think, a broader issue of to even be able to start to make predictions or scenarios, to Zachery's points, about the future. You need to know a lot more about how your adversaries are going to think about the future, and we may lack that educational baseline in the same way we lacked a deep knowledge of Islam within the intelligence community, 21 and a half years ago. So Elsa, what do you think about the Chinese education issue?
So I'll say to start that I'm also speaking from the perspective of being both a student and an instructor, and at some point in the long road to writing my dissertation. So I definitely sort of on both sides of the house in terms of seeking to educate myself and seeking to promote education with on these issues within this community. And I guess I would say I think there is incredible expertise, but also distinct limitations that are worrying at present. And I think the space of those of us who specialize in the study of China can be a very small world, for better and worse, which can be wonderful, but I think also speaks to that there are often a smaller number of people than one would expect who have deep expertise and are engaged in really in-depth research on any given issue of concern, whether that is some of the current debates around emerging technologies and how to study whether the political economy of their development or their implications for national security. I think there's definitely a need for more voices, more insights, and more talent to come into this community and conversation going forward. And I think there are, however, systemic and structural problems that have impeded the sort of scaling up you'd hope to see on several fronts, and I think some of which are unique to the condition of the study of China today, insofar as opportunities for, as I've mentioned, field work or study abroad or academic engagement are increasingly, to a certain extent, risky for anyone, regardless of the apparent sensitivity of their topic. And definitely, I know several universities are starting to withdraw either their language programs or their study abroad programming from China, given concerns about academic freedom and the ethics and concerns of student safety as well, of operating within that environment, which I think in some respects may be a reasoned decision, but I think also again limits the number of individuals and the generalized opportunities for folks to develop sort of firsthand experience living and working and studying in China, which I think is a loss. And I think we haven't really reckoned with how do you compensate for the closing window and the sort of shrinking opportunities for pragmatic and academic engagement through any number of channels. And so I think that there are these sort of trends and systemic features that are making it, in some respects, less appealing to study China or study in China. I think there's also sort of the fact that there's often less resourcing and programming at many universities than one might expect, certainly compared to the sort of Soviet studies enterprise during the Cold War. And I think I'm not speaking from a position of self-interest in saying there should be more funding for students in academic research, but I think certainly I can say, I think personally and professionally, that I think there is starting to be a ramping up of options, but still fewer than one might expect or hope to see, given the scale of the problems and the need for research and academic engagement. And I think the problem is also sort of twofold in the sense that there's the need to develop subject matter experts who specialize on China over the course of their careers. And I am of the philosophy there is no such thing as a China expert. We are all sort of lifelong students in this endeavor, and always learning and always reckoning with the limitations of our understanding. I think there's also the question of how to get those who aren't specialists on China, but whose work across any number of missions or institutions focuses on questions that relate to China, how to get sort of a baseline of knowledge and how to get the national security community as a whole up to speed, which I think requires engagement with analysts, academics, and subject matter experts, and also sort of a continuous learning and a willingness to sort of reorient in terms of focus and attention, even as other problems and issues of concern remain very urgent as well. So yes, I would say I think there's definitely, I think, incredible resources and expertise and opportunities within academia today. I hope we'll see sort of continued attention to what it would take to both to scale up, to build bridges, to expand opportunities, and also to ensure that the pipeline we're building is more open, is more equitable, and is more representative and inclusive, which I think means thinking about the question of diversity and creating more equality of opportunity within the space as well. I think there's a role that the US government can play in that through, again, a lot of the debate around Confucius Institutes has sort of been very reactive and very negative, but we haven't seen sort of that countered with how do we ensure that universities that may have Confucius Institutes, because they don't have other resources or other funding for Chinese language studies, how can we make sure that those universities have the resources necessary to have a choice and to expand their programming for students who aren't at universities that have existing programming in the space. So there's a lot more I could say. I will stop myself there for now, but I think I think it is both a wonderful and a challenging and discouraging moment to be engaged in the study of China in any space and from any angle. And I'm always, I hope that sort of those of us in the space can continue to learn from each other and try to welcome those who are coming into this community as students or as those with different sources of expertise that intersect with the problems we're trying to reckon with on China today.
Yeah, well, to your point earlier, it's tough to study a country that doesn't want to be studied. And I think we'll continue to actively make it more and more difficult for us to study it. So absolutely more ability to do so, more people focusing on it and being able to speak the language is going to be necessary.
I'll just add Taiwan is a wonderful opportunity both to build up language proficiency and for study in an environment that is welcoming. So for any students who are listening, I definitely would encourage you to explore options on that front as well. And I'm always happy to discuss with anyone who wants to reach out personally, because I think we're all students in this space and we're all learning.
William, I had a question for you, back to your point on the multipolar world. And I think we're probably all in agreement that Russia and China are part of that equation. But someone's asked a question here about intelligence alliances. And a lot of those alliances were formed, like Five Eyes, were formed during the Cold War. It was very cut and dry, bipolar world, and they evolved out of that. As we shift to a multipolar world, what do you see happening to intelligence alliances? Do they proliferate? Do they shrink? Are there multiple now competing alliances? How do you see that playing out?
Yeah, everybody get ready to write, because I'm absolutely certain of this answer. That's a really hard question. I think, just for purposes of planning, not to say this will play out, but I think it's reasonable to assume the current alliances will continue out of self-interest. For example, NATO, and various military-based alliances, alliances based on economic cooperation, which could change, of course. Countries could change their alignments, and alliances that have to do with transnational issues. If anything, you might see different directions on different issues, because it will be in the interest of majority of countries, for example, to combat maybe illegal trafficking in humans, an intelligence topic. But military matters could be quite different. And that would cause a lot of, I would assume, stresses within given intelligence organizations, where they're cooperating in some cases and sort of adversarial in others. But I do think, given the complexity of the situation and the fact that, what I've postulated is actually something to be for intelligence to research and see if it's actually happening, but could very well also be cooperative. So I believe the intelligence cooperation will increase. All the things I mentioned in my briefing would indicate that greater cooperation is necessary, and not just from intelligence organizations, from corporate entities and from non-traditional government, intelligence agencies like customs and immigration. And always a very touchy area, but perhaps NGOs if they're willing, but they have a lot of reasons not to cooperate with state intelligence agencies. So I would just say, and in general, an intelligence agency is trying to stay ahead of it would be lean forward very strongly on increased cooperation with anyone who sort of kind of wants to do it. That's an unsatisfactory answer, but that's really the best I can do, I guess.
No, I mean, I don't think there are any satisfactory answers to any of these questions. I think we're all processing the issues, but I've found the last 30 minutes of discussion really fascinating, and this is a good start to today's sessions and panels, as we all kind of try to tackle some of these issues that have come up over the last couple of sessions of this colloquium. So we're running up against 12:30 right now, which I believe we have a break for 15 minutes, but just wanted to thank you all for joining and for all your thoughts on some of these really hard to tackle questions. So appreciate that.
Okay, we'll reconvene in 15 minutes at 12:45 Eastern Time. Thank you.